Tonight, you'll get cold, and you'll grab a jacket without thinking twice. You won't consider it a decision, you won't consider it strange. But somewhere in the last few 100,000 years, one of your ancestors did something no other ape on this planet had ever done. They took the skin of another animal and put it on their own body. And that single act changed the direction of the human species. Why would a species with fur-covered ancestors need to invent fur of its own? Here's the strange part. You didn't just start wearing clothes because you were cold. You started wearing clothes because you had already lost the thing that kept you warm. Somewhere around 2 million years ago, your ancestors began to lose their body hair. Almost entirely. This is bizarre for a mammal. Nearly every land mammal on Earth keeps a thick coat for insulation. Humans didn't. Researchers like Mark Pagel and Walter Bodmer have proposed that this happened because early hominins were becoming long-distance runners on the hot African savanna, chasing prey across open ground for hours at a time. A furry body overheats fast. A bare, sweat-covered body can cool itself for miles. So evolution made a trade. You gave up your coat to become an endurance predator. But that trade came with a cost. Once the sun went down, or once your ancestors moved into colder climates, that same bear skin became a liability. You were now a mostly hairless primate walking straight into an ice age. So what did you do? You didn't grow the fur back. You couldn't. Evolution had already closed that door. Instead, you did something far stranger. You started taking fur from other animals and putting it on yourself. This is the moment clothing was born. Not fashion, not vanity, survival engineering. And here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Scientists don't actually know exactly when this happened because cloth and hide don't fossilize. They rot away in a few decades. So how do you find the invention of clothing hundreds of thousands of years after the fact? You don't look for the clothes, you look for the thing that lived on the clothes. In 2003, a geneticist named Mark Stoneking led a study that did something almost unbelievable. He looked at human body lice, not head lice, body lice, the kind that live specifically in clothing, in the seams and folds of fabric, and only move onto skin briefly to feed. Body lice cannot survive without clothing to nest in. So Stoneking's team calculated when body lice genetically diverged from head lice, essentially asking, when did this parasite first get an entirely new habitat to live in? The answer stunned researchers. Somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Think about what that means. Your ancestors were tracking parasites into a brand new material world. A world made of hide, sinew, and stitched skins. A world that hadn't existed before, and that a tiny insect adapted to exploit almost immediately. This tells you clothing wasn't a single invention. It was a slow technology, refined over tens of thousands of years, that eventually became sophisticated enough to host a permanent parasite population. That's not a caveman throwing a pelt over his shoulders one cold morning. That's decades, then centuries, then millennia of humans figuring out how to cut, shape, and wear animal hide well enough that insects could build a life inside it. And once clothing existed, everything changed. Anthropologist Ian Gilligan has argued that clothing may be one of the most underrated inventions in human history because of what it allowed your ancestors to do next. With insulated bodies, humans could now move into places that would have killed them a generation earlier. Siberia, Northern Europe, the Arctic edges of Asia, places with brutal winters and short growing seasons. Clothing wasn't just comfort, it was a passport into every hostile environment on Earth. Gilligan even connects this to something you might not expect. He's proposed that as clothing became more advanced, particularly fitted, sewn clothing using bone needles, it may have played a role in the extinction of Neanderthals. Modern humans arriving in Ice Age Europe appear to have had more sophisticated tailored clothing, using eyed needles found at sites dating back around 40,000 years. Better clothing meant better heat retention, meant more energy for hunting and reproduction, meant a population that could simply outlast a brutal winter more efficiently than their Neanderthal neighbors could. A needle and thread quietly reshaping the map of who survived an ice age. It's worth sitting with that lice study a little longer because of how strange the method really is. Stone King wasn't digging through soil looking for scraps of ancient hide. He was reading a genetic clock hidden inside a parasite that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid thinking about. Body lice can only live in the folds of clothing. Take the clothing away, and within days, the lice die out. So the moment body lice appear as a distinct, separate population in the genetic record, you know something remarkable happened. Humans had started wearing something on their bodies consistently enough, for long enough, that an entirely new ecological niche opened up. An insect species essentially evolved because your ancestors got dressed. That's the kind of evidence that should stop you in your tracks. You don't usually think of a parasite as proof of a technological revolution, but here it is. Somewhere in the last 100,000 plus years, a garment became a habitat. And once you know that, the rest of the Ice Age story reads differently. Because while modern humans were apparently perfecting fitted sewn clothing using eyed needles, their Neanderthal cousins, according to researchers who have studied Neanderthal tool assemblages, appear to have relied more on simpler draped hides, wrapped and pinned rather than tailored and stitched. It sounds like a minor difference. It isn't. A draped hide leaves gaps. Cold air slips in at the seams, around the arms, at the neck. A tailored, sewn garment traps heat far more efficiently. The same way a fitted coat today keeps you warmer than a blanket thrown over your shoulders. Across a single winter, that difference might mean nothing. Across thousands of winters, across generations of hunting trips, childbirths, and long migrations through Ice Age Europe, it could mean everything. None of this means clothing alone determined who survived and who didn't. Extinction is never that simple. But it's a strange thought experiment. One species figured out how to sew. The other didn't, or didn't do it as well. And only one of them is telling this story to you today. Now here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Clothing didn't just protect your body, it started to define you. Once humans had the ability to choose what covered their skin, they didn't stop at function. They started using it to say something. Archaeologists have found ochre-stained shell beads at sites in Africa and the Middle East dating back over 100,000 years, evidence that early humans were decorating themselves long before they were writing anything down. Clothing and adornment became one of the very first languages our species ever spoke. A way to say, without a single word, who you were, where you came from, and where you stood in your group. That means the sweater you put on this morning isn't just fabric. It's the direct descendant of a 100,000-year-old survival tool that quietly turned into a form of communication. Every time you choose an outfit, you're doing something your ancestors did the moment fur-covered animal skin became more than a shield against the cold. You're telling a story about yourself before you say a single word. Think about how far that idea travels. A stitched hide wasn't just keeping someone alive in a snowstorm. It was quietly becoming a status symbol, a tribal marker, a signal of skill, because not everyone could make one well. The best toolmakers, the best hide workers, likely held real value inside their communities. Clothing making wasn't a background chore. It was one of the first forms of specialized human expertise, something you got better at with practice, something that could make you indispensable to the people around you. A warm, well-made hide in the middle of an Ice Age winter might have been worth more than almost anything else you owned. And this is where the story loops back to your body again. Because clothing didn't just protect the humans who already existed, it changed which humans got to exist at all. Colder climates are unforgiving to infants. A newborn loses heat far faster than an adult, and for hundreds of thousands of years, that alone limited where humans could safely raise children. Once populations had reliable, well-made clothing and shelter, birth in colder regions became survivable in a way it hadn't been before. Some researchers studying the timing of human migration into northern latitudes have pointed out that population growth in these harsher regions tracks closely with the archaeological appearance of sewing tools and tailored hides. In other words, the invention sitting in your closet right now may have quietly expanded the map of where your entire species was allowed to reproduce and thrive. That's not a small thing. That's your ancestors hacking the rules of geography using nothing but animal hide and a sharpened bone. Now pause and consider how invisible all of this is to you today. You don't think about any of this when you're getting dressed. Clothing has become so automatic, so background, that it barely registers as a decision at all. But that invisibility is itself remarkable. The most successful technologies are usually the ones you stop noticing. Fire became invisible. Cooked food became invisible. And clothing, arguably one of the single most important survival technologies your species ever created, became so deeply woven into daily life that it disappeared into the category of simply being human. There's something almost poetic about that. The tool that let your ancestors escape the cold, outcompete other hominin species, and eventually settle nearly every corner of this planet is the same tool you use every single morning without a flicker of thought. You're not consciously solving a 2 million-year-old problem when you put on a coat. You're just cold, and there's a coat nearby. But underneath that simple action is an entire chain of survival, invention, and quiet revolution stretching back further than written history, further than agriculture, further than almost anything else you'd call civilization. And that hairless, sweat-cooled body you were born with? It's still the reason you're standing here at all. If your ancestors hadn't lost their fur to become better hunters, and hadn't then solved the problem they created by inventing clothing, humans might never have made it out of Africa's warm plains at all. You are, quite literally, wearing the solution to a problem your own species caused itself 2 million years ago. So the next time you're getting dressed, half asleep, barely thinking about which shirt to grab, remember what you're actually doing. You're not just getting dressed for the weather. You're putting on the oldest technology your species ever built to survive itself.